Hey, what's up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Roll Pod, an Alabama sports podcast for Bama 247. I am staff writer Cody Goodwin. I am back from vacation, suntanned with a brand new phone, too. Not that anything bad happened to my old one. It was just time to upgrade. And I'm here with Mike Rodak and Alex Scarborough. Through the power and magic of podcasting and the internet, we were able to get a show up last week where Mike and I did the non-quarterback draft. I still have a list of our draft picks, so we can circle back on that during the regular season when we get there. But I was gone for a week. So I figured for today's show, we could just kind of circle back on a few bigger topics of interest that I, maybe missed over the last week or so, and just kind of catch up on some things. And yeah, that's kind of more or less what I had planned. And I wanted to start with actually a story that dropped this morning. Alex, you got a chance to talk to Caden Proctor, Alabama's left tackle who transferred and then came back. Started as a true freshman for Nick Saban's final team last year. Seemed like he got homesick, went home 2 months later, turned around and came back. We knew previously that it was more or less a spring break trip with all of his old Alabama teammates that may or may not have fueled Proctor's decision to return. You got a chance to talk to him actually one-on-one, like his first time, I think, speaking with the media since post Rose Bowl availability, where he, opened locker rooms. So we were able to chat with him after that game. I don't want to give away the full details because it's behind our VIP paywall at Bama 247. So please go subscribe and go check it out because Alex did a fantastic job with it. But Alex, what'd you learn? Like, what were some of the big picture takeaways from talking with Caden Proctor?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear from the main principal himself. I mean, everybody has spent the last 4 months, including myself, kind of speaking for him. And, I've been able to talk to people around him, but to finally speak to him and have him explain the whole thing, I literally just asked him, like, walk me through this. Like, what happened here? And it's interesting you bring up him in the Rose Bowl media setting. And he admitted during that time he was already thinking about leaving. He'd gotten homesick. It was an up and down season. At that point, he had an ankle injury, tore a ligament in his ankle. He said it was really, this didn't make the story, but he was like, it was really tough. My, teammates are going to Disney. They're going to X, Y, and Z. They're doing all this. And I'm in the hotel getting, rehab the whole time. And I'm not myself when I play the game. I didn't put forth my best effort because of this injury. So that all happens. He's feeling all that. And then he goes to meet with Nick Saban shortly after the Rose Bowl and tells him, hey, I think I want to go to Iowa. And Nick talks him out of it. He basically reminds him, like, look, dude, you've got a future here. You're a big part of our plans. And he says, okay, I think it's going to work out. And fast forward how many days later, Nick retires. And that really is the thing that set this all off. It was interesting to hear Caden kind of put that into words. Like, I think he was hurt by the fact that Nick didn't tell him. I'm not sure Nick knew. To Saban's credit, he's so compartmentalized. But being caught off guard, like Caden was not even in Tuscaloosa for the official announcement. He couldn't make it back. He was snowed in, couldn't get there. To hear about it through a text message from friends, it turned a difficult decision into an emotional decision. And as we all know, even at this age, let alone at 18 years old, that's a bad thing. So it leads to him going to Iowa. Some weird circumstances there with NIL things being weird. Tutoring being weird, like medical being weird. And it's just like, this isn't the right situation for me. But not quite understanding is Alabama still an open door for me? So he continues talking to teammates. He's really close with Wilkin Formby, and knows that they want him back. Wilkin's been joking with him the whole time. You're coming back, man. This isn't a real thing. So one of the funniest parts is I asked Caden, like, so how do you know the coaches are going to welcome me back? He laughs and says, well, I got in the car with Wilkin, and Wilkin called the coaches and was like, asking, like, what do you think if this happened and that happened? And, what if Caden came back? And he's just silent the whole time. And they don't know he's in the car. And, whatever he hears, it works. So, he's coming back really, I think, humbled by the situation. His first stop, literally the first chance he could be in Alabama's football facility, he went straight to Kellen's boarder's office and said, I'm sorry. Like, I should have heard you out. when you tried to tell me everything after taking over, I just wasn't in the listening mood. I was done. So um, he knows this is a better situation for him. He regrets it. Called it one of the worst decisions of his life ever leaving Alabama. So I think he comes back humbled, a little bit more mature. I think anytime you go through a situation like he's gone through, you should learn from it. And oh, by the way, freshman All American who's put in the work this off season and really is eager to show that, hey, those struggles I had early, that Rose Bowl, I can play better than that. I can be one of the best tackles in the country. So he's definitely like one of the last things, like talking. And I asked him, like, what do you think people should know? And he goes, I'm ready to go. Like, I'm going to be a different person. He's very clearly motivated by this whole situation.
That's exciting to hear. Personally, coming down here from Iowa, I've known Caden Proctor for a really long time. I also know that a lot of guys in that Iowa signing class that he was a part of for months before flipping to Alabama were not particularly happy with the fact that he flipped to Alabama. And so, I know that in a previous story that you wrote, I believe with David Eicholt from Hawkeye Insider, the class up there at Iowa, when he got up there and transferred initially, not super thrilled that he was back, or they were kind of confused, or it wasn't maybe this super warm welcoming that maybe he was expecting a little bit, which kind of, I think, played a little bit into, why he decided to maybe turn and come back. I love the Wilkin Formby details in your story and just how big of a, proponent or how big of a factor he was in, really trying to bring Proctor back here, just continually pestering him, and then the phone call in the truck. Mike, I think Formby probably deserves a lot of credit if Proctor ultimately continues the ascent that we saw maybe late last season, and kind of fills in that. There's obviously he's of crucial importance to Alabama's offense this year, and Formby maybe deserves a little bit of credit if Proctor's able to live up to it and really help Alabama this upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit ironic because Wilkin Formby probably would have had a better chance to start at right tackle if Caden Proctor was Iowa, but I guess that speaks to, selfless nature to Wilkin. If Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Wilkin and Caden are both in the same church together in Tuscaloosa. So
they're very close.
Right. Yeah. And so, there's obviously a bigger picture at play, and that's, you talk about maturity and wisdom. I think, that's certainly being displayed by Wilkin Formby, because we all saw in the spring, without Proctor, Elijah Pritchett was your left tackle. And then we were talking about, all right, who's going to start at right tackle? Is it Wilkin Formby, who was out there for a couple practices that we saw, or would it be Miles McVay? And now you get to a situation where, from the conversation in the car that they had with the coaches, it seems like they're not going to make him climb back up the ladder and put him on the third team to like punish him. It seems like this is going to be a situation where Proctor comes back in with open arms and, obviously a new position coach and Chris Kapilovic, but I think we can safely say Caden Proctor's your left tackle. Then it gets you into a situation where Elijah Pritchett's competing with Wilkin Formby, and, Pritchett's the higher rated prospect. Obviously he has, some other off-field issues to deal with, but, it's selfless. I think that's kind of the word that comes to mind, with Wilkin Formby in the way that he handled this particular situation.
Well, and to jump in, like I remember one of the first questions from somebody who knows the SEC very well after the Caden Proctor announcement first hit that he was leaving Iowa, planning to come back to Alabama. This guy said, like, what the heck does this mean for the locker room? This is a guy who quit, now he's coming back. The fact that the guy bringing him back is his primary competition, in a sense, really tells you everything you need to know about that part of it. And I asked Caden about the locker room dynamics too, and he said not only did he apologize to Kalen DeBoer, he apologized to his teammates. And he said they've been very receptive. I mean, the fact that he and Wilkin and Tyler Booker went as a trio to Dallas to O-line masterminds to train last month really tells you, again, they're not going to shun him. This is not a situation like that. I think at the core of this all is a freshman who made a bad decision, and who didn't do that as freshman, or in my case as a sophomore, junior, senior after college. I just wasn't in the spotlight. Not to let Caden totally off the hook, but to say this isn't understandable, is ridiculous. This is the setup of college football now. It's a revolving door, and you're foolish if you think guys are not going to walk out, realize, oh shit, this isn't good. I'm going to walk back in. And one thing, not to give away one of the nuggets of the story, Iowa fans have every right to feel some kind of way about this. Even Caden said it. Like, I understand the negativity, but some of the accusations, some of the things are just beyond the pale. And to continually say this has been about NIL, it said I took a massive pay cut to come back. Like, not just a pay cut, like I'm losing money on this. I think it tells you that he wanted to come back to Alabama because he realized very quickly that he shouldn't have done it in the first place. And if it meant leaving some money on the table, he was ready to do that.
We will hopefully get to talk to Caden a little bit more. So, fall camp's still month and a half or so away, but interesting little subplot to what's already going to be a very, very interesting Alabama football season. Wanted to talk about another transfer ish. I mean, he left Alabama a little while ago, but Tyler Buchner recently penned an open letter on Notre Dame's website. Buchner's the former Notre Dame quarterback who transferred to Alabama and played all of 5 series. Well, I guess maybe a little bit more than that, but he made one start for the Crimson Tide last year. And then he transferred back to Notre Dame to join the lacrosse program, won a national title this past spring. Now he's returning to Notre Dame football as a walk-on receiver. In an open letter, Buchner wrote that he fell into a deep emotional hole after Nick Saban benched him during the South Florida game. Quote, what I had been working so hard for all these years suddenly felt like a pipe dream. He details a lot more in this open letter. What's our ultimate takeaway, Mike, of Tyler Buchner's open letter to Notre Dame, the Alabama details in there, and just this kid's journey as a whole? There's a lot of interesting things to take away from this, right?
Yeah, I did a story on him last summer when he was in the competition. And look, he's a smart kid. Like, his parents, his mom went to Yale, his dad went to Colgate, his dad is in some sort of hedge fund, financial, investing sort of deal. He went to a very, very ritzy school, prep school, high school. I think it was a combination of middle and high school in San Diego. And, I think for a while there, everything kind of seemed like it was paved. The road was paved for him to be a pretty high level quarterback. I mean, he was offered by Alabama pretty early on in high school. He was offered by every big school, and just had some, problems with the COVID year in California. He had an injury, the first game he was playing, I think it was his junior year, where he was like a fake punt and ended up tearing his knee up. So he missed a lot of time in high school and just never really became that guy that I think a lot of people expected him to be at Notre Dame. And then so I think he's still, when he made the move to go to Alabama, I think he was still trying to find that and still believing in himself as an NFL quarterback. And look, I think his window of opportunity at Alabama was very, very small. It was really just the first quarter and a half of that South Florida game. And by all accounts, he had a really good practice the week before that, which, helped Nick Saban make that decision. And then I think towards the end of his time out there in the field is when the skies opened and it was a downpour. So it's a very small sample size with him. And I think sometimes people hate on Tyler Buchner probably a little bit too much. And it wasn't that bad. He didn't throw an interception. It was lackluster, but it wasn't like
he did one hop a few too many passes for my liking. That's just one person's opinion.
In that very same stadium, I watched EJ Manuel, the former Florida State quarterback, throw 4 interceptions against the Bucs when he was playing for the Bills. And I've also watched Nathan Peterman, the former Tennessee and Pitt quarterback, throw 5 interceptions in the first half. So I've most definitely seen worse quarterback performances. It was not even.
We need to get Mike some good quarterback performances this fall.
But I think there was probably a little bit of an overreaction. I think it was more like the entire situation because they had just lost to Texas the week before. Now there's a little bit of chaos at quarterback and fans just really kind of piled on him. And that's probably where he's coming from when he's talking about going into this dark place. And again, everything had kind of been put out in front of him for a while in his career, or his playing career, if you want to call it that. And that was a huge turning point because I don't think anybody expects him to be an NFL quarterback. I think he still had an expectation at that point that he had a shot. And now you're talking about going to play lacrosse, and he even got demoted, 2 weeks after that USF game to number 4 in the depth chart. And now he's a walk-on wide receiver. So, you feel bad for him in some respects. Again, he's going to have a really good career outside of football. He's interning this summer at Goldman Sachs in New York.
Oh,
So
don't wait for him.
Tyler Buchner is going to be all right. He's just not going to be a football player. And anyway, to get back to the letter, like it was over the top. Like I will fully admit that, even being a Buchner guy, if you will. I talked to Tyler at the Rose Bowl, Rose Bowl Media Day, sat down with him. Again, great conversation. If you're being a walk-on wide receiver, like I don't know if we need a 8-paragraph, story about where kind of how you got there. Maybe he felt pressure that he had said, he was going to play lacrosse and kind of backdoored into playing football again at Notre Dame. Like maybe he felt like he had to explain himself there. But at the end of the day, I think, and I've seen mixed reactions to his stories. I think there's some people that have kind of mocked him, but there's also some people that I've seen that think he's really intelligent and a great writer and a great kid. And I think both of those are probably true and justified. Like I think when you have the opening paragraph about driving in your rented U-Haul from Tuscaloosa to South Bend, and the open road stretched ahead as I headed northward, a ribbon of asphalt leading me back to Notre Dame and the snow-draped streets of South Bend. Look, I go back to 7th grade. I had a teacher, or not 7th grade, and 10th grade. I had a teacher in high school whose name was Brian Murphy, and I wrote a story like that. It was like a English class, your composition or whatever. You had to write like a creative writing story. And my intro to that story was very descriptive like that. And I just remember him telling me, he's like, I don't want to hear that flowery language again.
God dang.
So maybe it's been beat into me from that. But my English teacher in high school was not a big fan of language that was a little bit over the top like that in your writing. So maybe I'm just, I have scar tissue from that. But I was reading that first paragraph. I'm like, man, Brian Murphy in St. John's High School would not approve of that.
I have 2 quick thoughts before we get to that more in the letter. I remember you talking to him at the Rose Bowl, and I remember like your immediate takeaway when we got back on the bus was like he seemed resigned to the fact that like this high level SEC football life was not him. Like he was not built for it. Like he
He was self-deprecating. He called himself the Walmart Jaden Daniels when he was on the scout team before the LSU game, which I thought was funny. Like, I feel like I'm sitting at the bar with this kid and he's making fun of himself. I actually appreciated it.
Yeah. And I mean, another thought that maybe comes to mind here is like this kid is not a bad athlete. Like I think a lot of people have that, and me included. That USF game is kind of the last memory we have of him, like with high level athletics. Like he was obviously a talented football recruit. He was obviously a talented lacrosse player, right? He, I don't know how much he played, but like Notre Dame won the NCAA lacrosse championship this past year going away. They had the best player in the country in Pat Cavanaugh, but like, Buchner was obviously good enough to be on that roster. He, there was some level of scholarship, there for him.
He got offered by Michigan in middle school to play lacrosse.
Yeah. So like clearly the dude is an athlete, and it's, I think maybe the letter on Notre Dame's website kind of speaks to the fact that it's a very uniquely Notre Dame website, right? Like this kid this uniquely Notre Dame story. Right. Kid goes to Notre Dame initially, like he has some pretty good moments. He good, not great. Leaves, comes back, right? Everybody loves a good, leave and then come back story, right? We just got done talking about Caden Proctor. Mm-hmm. So like I get it. And in South Bend, this is going to be a very interesting story to follow, especially, it's Marcus Freeman's 3rd year. So there's a lot of expectation there. And then you've got, this little subplot there in the receiver room. So that's, as much as we clown a little bit on Tyler Buchner, like there is some level of athletic talent there. And, the few times we got to talk to him, I'm pulling for the kid.
Yeah.
That said, interning at Goldman Sachs this summer, Alex, if the finance world doesn't work out, I think Tyler Buchner could probably write some books, man.
Yeah, I just think Notre Dame website needs an editor. I think that's all. They just need somebody to line edit a little bit more. As somebody who's been, I can write a little flowery myself. You just got to be held in check. I mean, I think we're all on the same page. We all like and want Tyler to have a great experience and have a great life. Like, go for it.
I'm rooting for the kid. I'm rooting for him.
I jokingly called him like the Forrest Gump of college athletics now because he's going to be everywhere. Like, he's going to play every sport. I want him to do it all. I want him to have the most college experience he can, and then maybe go to Goldman and become the 1% that we hate and make all the money. Good, do it. I just have notes on the letter itself. The letter was just over the top. Like, that sound you hear, Tommy Reese, is him backing over you with his car, saying that there were people whispering in his ears. Like, Tommy's the only guy I can imagine on that. The description of Alabama just kind of blew my mind because it was like from 30 years ago. I didn't understand it.
Right.
The whole calling girls miss, fill in the blank. I've been on Alabama's campus a lot the last decade. I don't really hear that.
Well, who's the most famous Miss in Alabama, right? Probably Miss Terry.
Yeah, maybe he's referring to her.
Yeah.
Also, burnt ends. They're a Kansas City thing. They're not an Alabama thing. It's pulled pork. Like, what are we talking about?
Shout out.
Yeah, there was a lot of things. Again, an editor could have gotten in there and said, you know what, we Wikipedia'd Alabama. We need to go a little bit deeper into our research to know what we're talking about here.
It seemed a little bit forced.
Yes.
But it also, like, a Notre Dame fan reading that, it's probably like, yeah, like I'm sure it's exactly what it's like.
And it's very like Notre Dame's the most pure thing in the world. And as a lapsed Catholic, great. But like, again, the letter was over the top. I just want him to have a great experience. It was very weird. It's going to be remembered as a weird thing at Alabama. Like, remember when this happened? Remember when the USF game, I think itself could be a whole mini documentary, but I want him to have success. It's just the letter was just kind of absurd to me. It was a good laugh, and I hope he continues the writing thing, because if you hone it, man, you've got to have the description. You got to have all those things. You just got to bring it in a little tighter. That's all.
Completely
Focus less on the flowery language and more on the details, because there's some fun details in here, man. Like, there's a few lines in here that I would not have cut if I was his editor, right? Like, I did not go left into the football facility. Instead, I turned right to the lacrosse offices. Like, that's cool. That's a cool little detail there, right? Like, I didn't need the last sentence where I asked for a lacrosse stick. Like, you going into the lacrosse offices does the job for me. Like
a rental U-Haul. I'm pretty sure nobody bought a U-Haul. So we're all writers on this call, so this is not fair. But at the same time, these thoughts went through my mind.
I felt the cold and crisp air envelop me, each breath a sharp reminder of what I had missed. I mean, it's
good. It's good.
Maybe it's AI. I don't know. It's entirely possible that it's AI, but
the ghost of Ernest Hemingway.
There might be a 30 for 30 on the letter itself.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if this was an AI letter? Like, there are some lines in here that make me think maybe.
Yeah.
Like, there's
some sort of AI fact check that professors use for all papers now. Maybe we can run it through that.
A few days before, I was at the Rose Bowl, and the refrain of Dixieland Delight at Bryant-Denny Stadium still echoed in my ears. Like, are you at the Rose Bowl or are you at Bryant-Denny Stadium? Like, that's where the editor in me is like, we got to hack this up, man. Like, I get what you're trying to say, but too many words. Too many words.
I'm trying Chat GPT right now. But Chat GPT is telling me I'm not aware of any Tyler Buchner leaving Alabama for Notre Dame. So,
so we can rule out AI,
I guess.
We can rule out AI. The one other thing from this,
I do want to see walk-on receiver Tyler Buchner. I want to see what that looks like. Is it a double pass and that's the end of his story there, or can he be a little slot receiver? Very curious about that.
Yeah, no, or does he try to become a quarterback again? Is this like his agreement just to get back on the team and then
watch out Riley Leonard?
Right. I mean, then he thinks he still has a shot at quarterback, and it makes his triumphant return and has to write another letter about that. I think he still has 2 years of eligibility left, so he's got some letters.
Well, and there have been success stories of quarterbacks or backup quarterbacks making the transition to that slot receiver role, right? Because as a quarterback, you got to see the entire defense. You got to know what's going on, both sides of the ball. So like as a slot receiver, like that helps you out, right? Spatial awareness, where to go, finding the pockets in the defense, knowing what your quarterback wants to do, right? There's been a lot of successful slot receivers at all levels of football that have done that. So it would not shock me at all if like that's his role and he finds a little success in it. And then, worst case scenario for Notre Dame, you've got some quarterback depth in the receiver room, right?
It would shock me, but in a good way.
I would still write about it. I think there's some opportunity there for us.
And to tie a bow on the Buckner letter conversation, like there are lessons from Tuscaloosa that he's going to take with him that make me think, a success story or a successful ending, will be, pun intended, written here. After the, you mentioned the, Walmart Jaden Daniels as the scout team as Alabama prepared for LSU. He wrote about that in his letter, right? Like, he felt hopeless and he hated football, but he had dug deep to realize, this is from his letter, that I would have to seek new goals there in Tuscaloosa. I'd never played scout team before, but ahead of LSU, I pulled myself out of my funk and volunteered to run scout. After the game, Coach Saban found me and thanked me for helping the team beat the Tigers. I had discovered a new role on the team and recognized that one bad game would not define my contribution. I learned to truly appreciate having shared goals in the common pursuit of excellence, even if I was not playing. So like, talk about maturity with Caden Proctor, a little bit of maturity here with Tyler Buckner here too, that might serve him well in the long run, for the next couple years, trying this walk-on receiver thing at Notre Dame.
Not to run propaganda for the NCAA, but success is not always, are you a draft pick? Like, you can have success outside of that. And I think we all sort of agree that Tyler has a chance to be successful no matter what it is. And again, good for him. Like, my college experience was very limited in terms of class and going to the bar too many times. Like, he's having a lot of different experiences and, enjoy it, young man.
That's right.
One other thing I missed while I was gone, SEC spring meetings. I still don't know that I fully personally understand the point of the SEC spring meetings, but they're a thing. People meet up in Destin. The coaches are there. The ADs are there. Other SEC higher ups are there. There were things to discuss, probably more league wide than anything like specific to Alabama. Alex, you were down there for us. What was maybe your biggest takeaway from the SEC spring meetings?
I was not down there, just to be clear. I was able to listen into Kalen DeBoer, but I have been down there 10 times at least, and was able to consume a lot of what was coming out there. And a lot of it began and ended with, what does the house settlement mean? Are there going to be walk-on players anymore? What is the future of college football? I mean, that's what that event generally boils down to, is the biggest of big picture items. And that's what they're talking about behind closed doors when reporters are not pestering coaches with questions. Yeah, they're at the beach, but they're not spending a lot of time at the beach. They might get a drink outside one afternoon, but that's about it. So yeah, it's to me, it's more a signal that we're getting along in the off season. And it's I don't know if it happens this way every time, but the fact that I'm pretty sure they started on Tuesday, and Tuesday was when players reported for off-season conditioning and all of those things. So it signaled that we were moving along. But in terms of deciding things, didn't really happen. They're more just in the information gathering phase, still talking about, I don't even know if they talked about formally 8 or 9 conference schedule games. I know that's still something that's going to be bandied about. And I will say, from talking to people, it's not that Alabama is opposed generally to 9 games. I think it is if we do this, there's a lot X, Y, and Z that has to happen next in terms of figuring out, okay, we've got a bunch of non-conference games that now do not maybe make sense in terms of having a schedule that's not just absurd. So I think there's still a lot to be determined. That's kind of always what comes out of those events. But yeah, it's to me more a signal that we're getting somewhere, because Media Days is only right around the corner now.
Yeah. And regarding the 8 to 9, or 8 versus 9 conference games, what are we waiting on? Like, why doesn't the SEC move to 9 conference? Get like the Big 10 does it. I believe the Big 12 already does it. Like, is this just a case of like a few schools holding the SEC hostage in terms of the 8 versus 9 argument? Like, what are we doing here?
It's simple. It's for people not watching. It is money. It is always money. It is ESPN saying you're under contract. Why should we pay you more? The SEC saying please pay us more. No. Okay. Well, until that happens, until the ESPN is willing to pay X number more beyond what they're paying right now, those schools that are on the fence are not going to get off of it. They're going to say, why should we make a more competitive schedule if we're not being compensated? Now, the interesting wrinkle in this is the dynamic of the House settlement being that a huge chunk of money is about to flow out of athletic departments might push them into a corner where they really do have to do this in order to figure out how to kind of balance that out. They might need the ninth game. They're probably going to get it eventually, anyways, but they might need it to offset some of the whatever the number is, $20 million a year, whatever the number ends up being. It's a massive amount for athletic departments that are not what I would say run efficiently budget wise. So they're going to have to figure out where that money comes from. I think it will come from the ninth game. It's just a matter of when.
And I'm sorry for my brief absence there. I had to take a phone call to schedule my gutters to be cleaned. It's one of those things. It's like you can't set it up online. You can't text them. It's like they have to call you. And if you don't pick up the phone, it's like impossible to get them back on the phone. So I'm like, I can pick up the phone and just get it done, or I can try to call them back 6 other times today. So anyway, I'm sorry if I wasn't fully engaged there for a second, but on the point of 8 versus 9 conference games, I think there's several factors at play. And look, typically the SEC's summer meetings, or is it spring, summer? I feel like they call them spring, but it's really summer. If you're down there in Destin, it's like
90 degrees
outside, and it's 62 degrees in the basement that you're in all day. But typically those are, I mean, there's productive rule change votes that happen there over the years, especially with, presidents and ADs are there. So they do sometimes vote on things. But I think right now there's too much big picture uncertainty to really get into the details. Just because we don't know what college football in general is going to look like in 2 years. It's hard to say, here's what our SEC conference schedule is going to look like, because that could be affected by a lot of different things. So, yes, I mean, money is certainly the big one in terms of can they get more out of ESPN for that extra slate of games. If they don't, then there's no point in adding those games. But there's also the playoff implications that we've heard them talk about a lot, where right now they're expanding to 12 starting this year, but the new CFP deal starts in 2026, so in 2 years, and there's already been talk about further expanding it to 14 or 16. So once you get to a point where you're playing a lot of playoff games, then there's probably a diminished effort to expand the SEC schedule, just because it doesn't make sense to play 9 games if you're going to be playing all the way through December and into January. So there's a lot of just, you have to wait for things to go in order. And right now, the playoff committee is really kind of in flux in terms of, are they going to go to 14 or whatever? So things just need to happen elsewhere. But if they do end up going to 9, you would have to imagine they're going to start chipping away at some of Alabama's non-conference games, which I think we're all excited about. We've talked about it on the show before, like going to Wisconsin, and then, further down the line, there's Florida State, there's Notre Dame, there's Boston College. I think they schedule for like 2034. And there's multiple of those games now where
you made the Mercer game interesting. Remember that?
Right. So if you go to 9, again, it becomes really tough to have those 2 big non-conference games like they have this year with just one big one actually with Wisconsin, right? But they're adding
don't disrespect Western Kentucky like that.
Well, South Florida.
South Florida, yeah. But there's just a lot of sort of dominoes that need to happen, and I don't think right now 8 versus 9 is really at the forefront. But as Sankey said, they got to figure that out within the next year, because they got to put together a 2026 schedule before we know it. So, I mean, right now it's just they made their 2024 schedule just sort of off the cuff, picking teams temporarily for an 8-game schedule, and then they just flipped it for 2025. So whoever you played at home, you play on the road. But that's not going to satisfy people. And there's still the issue of if you have 3 permanent opponents, you go to 9. Who are Alabama's? Is it going to be equitable? Nick Saban was always a proponent of 9 games. He got mad about LSU being on that list. So, as Sankey said, like sometimes when you have a bunch of people in a room, like nobody really agrees. Like you have to just kind of make decisions on your own. So eventually the SEC is probably just going to have to, do something to put together a new schedule. And it may not make everybody happy, but that's just kind of the name of the game.
We have to accept at some point that equity is a lie in college.
Right.
It's never, parity is not a real thing. Equity is not a real thing. And, every conversation right now, it really does bother me, is about money and lawsuits and all of these things. And I get it. Like it's what's pushing the sport in every direction that it's going right now. But the 8 versus 9 thing should be simple. You have to have 3 permanent opponents. For the SEC to have any semblance of what it's been, to hold on to any history that it's been, as you've expanded, okay, add a couple teams, fine. But for Alabama not to play LSU every single year, to not play Tennessee every single year is absurd. It should not be that way. And I get, again, it's not going to be fair for everybody, but that's okay. In an expanded playoff, why is that the worst thing in the world? You're either good enough or you're not. If you're 14th and you don't get in a 12 team, sorry, I'm not going to weep for you. Like we need these games that matter to people. Otherwise, the SEC might as well just be best football conference. It shouldn't. I mean, just name it some random thing. Like you need to hold on to what it's been, and what it is built on in large part is these rivalries that really matter to people.
And the other part of that is we don't know what's going to happen next in realignment. Mm-hmm. Like if the SEC can get its hands on North Carolina because there's some loophole in the ACC grant of rights that Florida State's been chipping away at, trying to find private equity money to fight their lawsuits. Like if the SEC can get North Carolina, then you're adding another team and you're just blowing the whole schedule model up again to accommodate that. So there's bigger picture things that kind of supersede the smaller picture stuff. But it's one of those things too, where I think the point of the committee is to decide if Alabama played LSU, Tennessee, and Auburn, and all 3 of those teams are really good, and they had a harder schedule than Georgia, and they lost an extra game because of that, the committee is supposed to have the brain, because they're humans, to figure that out and look at strength of schedule and strength of record and all that, as they do in basketball. And that's something that Nick Saban's talked about. Like in basketball, that's a bigger deal, is Alabama goes and loses to Arizona, Purdue, and Creighton back-to-back games in December, and they still get whatever seed they were in March, I forget, because people expect them to be a really good team who just played a harder schedule. But we've been so locked into this mentality in college football where it's like you're undefeated, you're in the playoff. You have 1 loss, you're on the bubble. You have 2 losses, you're out. But that doesn't – you expand the schedule, you expand the playoff, that doesn't really hold the same sort of water. So that's something I think just philosophically the committee's going to have to do before some of these coaches feel more comfortable playing a longer or harder schedule, a longer SEC schedule, and playing some of the teams that, that might be your permanent opponents.
And one of the interesting things, we kind of glossed over everything that came out of Destin because not a lot happened, but the idea of load management, if there are more games, and how you sort of navigate a full season, that will be interesting to see because injuries are a real thing. I don't know what that looks like in practice. It may just be a philosophy more than an actual here's how we do things, holding players back. But I will be curious to see if over the next X number of years, if there are a lot of teams that just limp into the playoff because it's the wear and tear of what it is.
And, Nick Saban's famous for playing guys in that FCS game, the Mercer game, whatever it was this year. And last year was Chattanooga, right? And that's kind of like his thing. It's like you're going to play because it's in a game and it's important as every other one. But I think a newer school coach, which I would put Kalen DeBoer in that category, may have a different philosophy and may be like, hey, that could be a good game to get Austin Mack some reps. So, that saves some bodies too, heading into what could be a tough stretch. The Iron Bowl and they play in the SEC championship, and then you're playing a playoff game 2 weeks later, which is really the newest part of this all, is getting used to that game. I guess really the weekend before Christmas, that would be that first round playoff game if you don't win the SEC.
Yeah. Well, and along those same lines, DeBoer didn't say too much, at least too many interesting things out of Destin. But one of the things he did mention that I thought was a little intriguing was, he was asked, ideal roster size and walk-ons, because they're floating the idea just college football nationally of maybe shrinking roster sizes and, scholarship limits and things of that nature as, money gets poured in and things change completely. He made the point that, like, the crazy thing is, and this is straight from his transcript that you posted, Alex, people always look and say only 11 are on the field at a time, but there's a lot more that goes into development. There's a lot more that goes into putting together a practice that I think is sufficient. There's a health and safety piece for sure that comes into play when it comes to roster size. So he's, between NAIA and, his trek toward the highest parts of D1 college football, he's had to deal with all sorts of different roster sizes, all sorts of different scholarship stuff going on. But I thought that was interesting, that it's not just, the 11 guys on the field. It's, hey, there is a developmental piece to this. And there's a lot of programs nationally. I know Alabama probably didn't fall into this category, but it still takes place in Tuscaloosa, developmental programs, right? Like, look at, we mentioned them earlier, but Iowa, like, big developmental program. Like, they're not a program that I think is routinely going to contend for Big Ten and national titles, but they do put a lot of dudes in the NFL because they're able to develop a lot of these guys, specifically at defensive back, specifically at linebacker, specifically at tight end, offensive line. They have a history of doing that too, that go on and, have productive professional careers. But that was one of the few things that I kind of thought was interesting. Just the what are DeBoer's thoughts on this? And, there is a little bit more to it than just the guys that primarily play on Saturdays. They're all, the depth piece to it, but also the developmental piece to it as well.
Yeah, we don't think of Alabama as a developmental program, but the way they practice is. It's not entirely unique anymore, but the idea of two spotting, which is basically like you've got two separate practices almost happening at the same time, because you can field two teams, offense and defense. And those reps for those players who are going primarily against the walk-ons, you think about true freshmen, redshirt freshmen, those are important. They add up over the course of the year to where when they go into the next season, they're not starting quite at square one. So it does matter. It will be interesting to see that if there is restriction, if they can still do that. And Kalen said, look, there is a model out there. There is an NFL model of practice. It would require some different sort of things. Do you have, quote unquote, practice squad? Maybe there are workarounds so you can still have this, because I do think it is good for the game, good for players. And that piece should still be in place, even if it doesn't look the same. If the sideline doesn't look quite as full during a game as what we're used to.
And I do think the NFL model is probably the best way to go, because if you have walk-ons in a traditional sense and they're not paid because you're only paying your scholarship players, then you're probably opening yourself up to some sort of lawsuit. Like, it's the whole idea of unpaid labor, I think, is what's driving all of this. And I think that's what's driving the idea that everybody on the roster needs to be under scholarship, so we're paying them. And you can have a practice squad of guys who, it's just a lower salary, or, it doesn't have to be the guy from Tuscaloosa County High School who's just happy to be there. Like, you can probably find some, what we would call like PWOs right now, and be legitimate practice squad players, maybe with the opportunity to get called up, get a bigger salary. Like, I think, Greg Sankey likes to say, blue sky thinking. Like, you have to be open to the possibility of an entirely new model on how rosters work, and the NFL one is probably the way to go.
Yeah.
It's a good point.
Protect you legally, which is what this is all about.
It's amazing until 2024 for all of these issues to come to a head. Like, that is the unique thing about how college football survived in the manner it did for as long as it did is really remarkable, because on the face of it, it makes almost no sense. It's just got this history that it was allowed to be what it was. And change comes for everybody, and it's come for college football.
Maybe we should give Mark Emmert more credit than typically has got.
No.
He held it together for a while. He kept the
house of cards stood for a really long time under Mark Emmert. Final thing I wanted to get to, this kind of happened right as I left last week, but Alabama men's basketball got some really, really good news. Both Mark Sears and Jaron Stevenson opted to exit the NBA draft process, return to Alabama for another year. They fill out scholarship spots 12 and 13 on the roster. Looking at the roster top to bottom, the Crimson Tide are going to be absolutely loaded with talent. In literally every direction, at literally every position. There's going to be a lot of fun things that Nate Oates can do with this Crimson Tide team next winter. Their national title odds are equal to football at last check, which is a little crazy. The way too early college basketball polls have Alabama routinely in the top 2. There's at least one that has them as, way too early preseason number 1. Almost all of them have them at least in the top 5. Mike, is Alabama a basketball school now?
I mean, the last time that probably happened where the odds were better in basketball was probably like 01, 02, when they were number 1 in the country for a while. Alabama was kind of in a hole in football. So it's definitely been 20 years, I would say, since that's been true. And I'm just looking right now to see if it's still true. Alabama's up or down. I don't know which one you want to call it. They're actually improved their odds to plus 1,200 in basketball. This is on Caesars. And so in football, maybe we have a story brewing right here that the basketball odds are now better than football. In football futures, Alabama's at plus 1,600. So their odds are better in basketball by a considerable amount now to win a national championship.
So I'll ask again, is Alabama a basketball school now?
I don't think so, no. But it's one of those things, that's something that has to change over a long period of time. And I think quite frankly, it would take the football team to perform poorly and be in a pretty deep rut over a decade or two to get to a point where fans are apathetic about football and more passionate about basketball here. It's really hard to change what how deeply rooted football is in the culture here. That's just not going to change over a couple of years of success in basketball. And, by the way, a football team that's been to the playoff last year too. So it would take a lot. And even, Nate Oates was on the Andy Katz podcast last week and was talking about the possibility of him leaving to go somewhere else. Like, obviously the Kentucky job was open, and he kind of said, yeah, there was other schools with a better basketball tradition. And again, Nate is very honest all the time. Like, I think that's almost an admission that Alabama is not really a basketball school. He was talking about Kentucky, in terms of a school with a better basketball tradition. So I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. I think more people will tune into football games. More people will read our stories about football. Like, it's hard to get people engaged with basketball here. And I think it's certainly grown. The audience has grown, but it's still nowhere near what football is, just walking up and down the street and talking to people.
Yeah. Well, ask Kentucky football what it's like to be on the flip side of that argument. You can be as good as they've been under Mark Stoops for the last X number of years, and it's still Kentucky basketball is the biggest thing. Florida basketball had a run of several years there. They didn't overtake Florida football during that time. It's just, it takes a long time and a lot of winning. And yeah, the football team probably needs to dip in order for there to be a reversal, but it doesn't need to happen. The interesting thing to me is I don't know if I agree with the odds in one sense. Like, I do think Alabama basketball is stacked. There are less questions to me about Alabama basketball than there is about Alabama football. The road to a championship, I would argue, is more of a straight path in football than it is in basketball. The NCAA tournament is a crapshoot sometimes. It is the team that gets to the end. Yeah,
very volatile.
It's not always the best team overall. Who gets hot? Weird things happen. Football is a little bit more logical, I would say. So I would argue if I was betting, if it was my money, and I don't bet because I just don't trust teenagers to make the right decisions all the time. I would put my money on football just because I think it's an easier path there. You see these, and I think it almost qualifies as a super team. It's at that stacked. Like, honestly, if Holloway pans out, I think they have the potential to just be like a roster that we laugh at. They're that good. But we've seen teams like this that don't make it to the end. Doesn't mean they're not good. Doesn't mean they weren't well coached. It just means that the tournament is a beast unlike any other.
Yeah, you have to stay healthy, and Nate talks about it a lot. Like, the best team doesn't always win in March. The best team throughout the regular season. So, and I think the football odds, the best teams like the Georgia, Texas, the teams that have the highest odds, those odds are a lot shorter than the best teams with college basketball odds, like Kansas, UConn, Alabama, reflecting some of that. Like, you're plus 1,000 as the favorite to win a national title in basketball, whereas you're probably plus 300 to win a national title in football, just because it's simpler. Now, there's probably been some adjustment to that with the 12-team playoff, because there's a little bit more variability that I'm sure will show up with that. There's not any data on that yet, so I don't know if the bookies know how to handle some of that. Like, what's Georgia's odds to win a national championship this year with a 12-team playoff as compared to what it would have been with the 14 playoff? I think they're probably worse. Every team is probably worse. So, probably a game of cat and mouse, because Greg Sankey might want to expand the NCAA basketball tournament, and then even becomes even more of a crapshoot. So, as things kind of grow, you do get to a point where the team that's holding up the trophy at the end of the season may not have been the best team that year.
Yeah. Well, and to, circle back to that, Nate Oates, Andy Katz interview, he straight up said, like, I always appreciate his honesty. He straight up said, like, this is a team, this is a roster that we can probably truly contend for a national championship with, which, you combine the Final Four run from last year, you combine the fact that they have a lot of the key pieces, almost all of the key pieces returning from that team. You combine the, A+ off season that Oates had in combining, stellar recruits, a stellar transfer class, being able to re-recruit Mark Sears back. Jared Stevenson had moments last year. You look at the national title odds, you look at the way too early polls. I think the floor for this team, the ceiling is certainly higher than last year's team, but they're going to start with a much higher floor as well. As we sit here early June, many, many months away from the start of the 24-25 basketball season, what should be reasonable expectations? What should the goal of this? Is it just to the Final Four? Is it to take one more step to the title game? I think, saying national championship kind of, we know how fickle and volatile that tournament is. Seasons, right. There's injuries up and down. Like, what is a reasonable expectation? Is it just a return to the Final Four, or is it maybe one more step to the title game?
Yeah, I think the whole unfinished business line is probably dangerous. Nate Oates loves to talk to Nick Saban and get advice. And I would imagine if he talks to Nick Saban on this, Saban will probably say, let's back off all the talk about unfinished business. And we made it to the Final Four last year. Now we got to get over the hump. Like, each year's its own animal, each game's its own animal. I'm sure Nate's going to try to keep the focus on, what's ahead of them in non-conference to start, which is, again, playing some pretty tough games. They go to Purdue, they play Creighton, Illinois. There's just another one that they scheduled. Oh, they're going to North Dakota.
Yeah, great.
And you just kind of have to take it as it goes. And look, I mean, there's been an injury every year that Nate Oates has been here. Something always seems to happen. Not to blame anybody. I'm just saying that's just historically what's happened. And then that starts to throw a wrench in things. And you just never know, from June until next March, like, you don't know how things are going to look. So I think the best coaches are probably the ones that are going to keep players in the moment and try to, again, kind of tamp down all the talk about unfinished business and running it back, and just kind of the expectations that do have the potential to kind of weigh on them, probably more than they need to.
I think there's a lot of players on this team. Sears is one of them too, that there are individual points in their game that they can improve upon in terms of getting to the next level, that there's enough to chip away at in terms of the developmental piece that you don't have to focus on championship or bust.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Final Four is reasonable. I think there's a reason teams celebrate the Final Four like they do, celebrate almost like they won a national championship. And I think it's because coaches know just getting there, you've put yourself in the position to win it. And that is in a field of 68, God, it's going to be even bigger now. That is a major accomplishment. So I think as long as you get there and it looks the way it's supposed to, like, whether that's overcoming injuries, whether that's players developing into the best they can be. I think if you lose in a Final Four setting, as long as you're competitive, I think that's okay. I think that's where they need to be, though, because I think anything short of that, it's going to ring a little bit hollow.
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. That's, get to the semifinals again, give yourself that opportunity to contend to get to the last game of the season. I think that would be, again, sitting here early June, many months away from the start of the season, that to me, I think would qualify as a success. Put yourself in position to take the next step and see where it goes.
Yes.
That's all we've got today, guys. This was fun. It was a fun little catch up. I feel like I know everything that's going on now after missing a full week. So appreciate you guys coming on and catching me up. We'll be back probably sometime later this week. I need to circle back with Brett. There's been a lot on the recruiting trail that we need to catch up on. So I'll link up with Brett for another show later this week. In the meantime, be sure to rate and review this show wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, even our Bama 247 YouTube page. Subscribe to Bama 247 and 247 Sports. You can read Alex's excellent interview with Caden Proctor. I believe we have a deal coming up. We always have a deal around June. 60% off VIP membership. Absolutely take advantage of that now, because like we mentioned, June might be a long, empty-ish month, but before long, SEC Media Days is going to be here. Fall camp's going to be here. And next thing you know, week 1 is going to be here. So get on the wagon now while you still can. As always, we appreciate you guys for listening, and we'll talk to you all again soon.